They thought I was losing my mind. They said it quietly at first, the way people do when they're not quite ready to say it to your face. A murmur between my daughter and her husband at the kitchen table. A pause that lasted a half-second too long when I'd walk into a room. Then, after a while, they stopped being quiet about it. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a land surveyor for the province of Ontario, walking frozen fields in February and measuring plots of land that would become subdivisions, hospitals, schools. I know how to read a map. I know where property lines are, and I know, better than most, that what belongs to you can be taken if you are not careful about where you put the markers. My wife passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer, swift and merciless. Her name was June, and she was the kind of woman who kept a bird feeder outside every window of our house in Barrie, because she said a house without birds was a house not paying attention to the world. After she died, I kept the feeders filled. It was the least I could do. My daughter, Adrian, was 34 when her mother passed. She had married a man named Clifton the year before, a sales manager for a medical supply company out of Mississauga. Very good-looking, very good at shaking hands, the kind of man who can hold eye contact for exactly the right amount of time and make you feel like you're the most important person in the room. I did not trust him from the first winter dinner I met him, but June liked him, and I trusted June more than I trusted myself. So I let it go. For a while, things were fine. Adrienne called on Sundays. She and Clifton would come up to Barrie for the holidays. I'd barbecue salmon on the deck, and we'd play cards, and it all looked like something from a television commercial for life insurance. But after June died, the visits changed. They came more often, and the questions changed too. Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the house? Dad, Clifton's cousin is a financial planner, maybe just a conversation. Dad, you shouldn't have all that sitting in a checking account. I want to be fair. Some of those questions were probably genuine. Adrienne loved her mother, and she was grieving too. But Clifton's involvement grew in a way that didn't feel like grief. It felt like inventory. The house in Barrie is paid off. June and I bought it in 1991 for $212,000, and it's worth somewhere north of $800,000 now. We also had a small investment portfolio that I'd built up carefully over 3 decades. Nothing spectacular. A mix of GICs, some dividend stocks, a few mutual funds inside my RRSP, and a TFSA I'd been contributing to since the program started. Conservative. Boring. Exactly how I like it. Clifton started calling it dead money. You're sitting on assets that could be working for you, he told me over dinner one October, pouring wine I hadn't asked for into my glass. The market's changing. There are opportunities right now that won't be around in 5 years. I asked him what he meant. He had a folder ready. He always had a folder ready. He explained a private real estate investment trust, a private REIT, he called it, registered in Alberta, tax-advantaged, managed by a colleague of his, double-digit returns. He said the word guaranteed 3 times in 4 minutes. I counted, and I kept my face very still the way I do when I'm reading a survey line I don't trust yet, because something underneath it felt soft. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled and topped up my wine again. Over the next 8 months, I said I'd think about it 11 more times. Each time he had a new folder. Each time there were testimonials, quarterly reports, charts that went up and to the right. Each time, Adrienne sat beside him and looked at me with something I can only describe as rehearsed concern, the expression of someone who has been told what expression to wear. What neither of them knew is what I do at my kitchen table every morning between 5:30 and 7 a.m. After June died, I couldn't sleep past 5, so I started reading. Not novels, documents, regulations, the Ontario Securities Act, the rules around exempt market dealers, prospectus exemptions, how private investment products are legally allowed to be sold and to whom. I had time and I had coffee and I had nothing to lose, so I read until I understood it. And what Clifton was describing, the way he was describing it, to someone of my age, without a single disclosure document in sight, that was not legal. I did not tell him this. I said I'd think about it. The thing on my bookshelf, the thing that matters here, is a small wooden clock. June gave it to me on our 25th wedding anniversary. Swiss movement, walnut case, about the size of a hardcover book. She'd had it engraved on the back, for the man who always knew where the lines were. I keep it on the shelf to the left of the television, where it faces the kitchen table. 2 Christmases after June passed, I replaced the movement inside it. The clock face, the hands, the sound, all identical. But behind the face, I installed a small digital recorder and a pinhole camera, the kind you can order online for under $200. I set it to motion activation. I did not tell anyone. I told myself it was because I wanted to feel safe alone in the house. That was partly true, but the fuller truth is that I am a man who spent his career making sure things were documented, measured, on record. Old habits don't retire just because you do. The following spring, on a Sunday afternoon in April, Adrian and Clifton came for lunch. I made soup, a beef and barley, June's recipe. We ate. We talked about nothing for a while. Then Clifton asked me again. This time it wasn't a folder. This time he had a tablet, and he turned it toward me and showed me an account. An account in my name, he said, that his colleague had already set up, pre-populated with my information. All I had to do, he told me, was transfer the funds and sign the enrollment form. I looked at Adrian. She was looking at the table. I'd need to see a prospectus, I said. Clifton smiled. These are exempt market securities, Dad. Retail prospectus rules don't apply. I nodded slowly. I see, I said. Let me sleep on it. That was the last time I was going to say that. That evening, after they left, I reviewed the recording. Everything was clear. His voice, her silence. The screen of the tablet briefly visible when the camera angle caught the window reflection. His exact words about the account being pre-populated. All of it, crisp and usable. Over the following 3 weeks, I made 4 calls. The first was to the Ontario Securities Commission's investor inquiry line. The second was to a lawyer in Barrie, a woman who specializes in elder financial abuse, which is, apparently, a specialty that has enough business to sustain a full practice. The third was to my financial institution, where I spoke to the branch manager directly and flagged the account for review. The fourth was to my family doctor, because I wanted a formal cognitive assessment on record. Full marks, documented, dated. My lawyer, her name is Beverly Ochterberg, and she is 61 years old and has the kind of quiet that means she's already 5 steps ahead of you, told me that what Clifton had described constituted an unauthorized distribution of securities. She told me that the pre-populated account, if it had been funded, would likely have moved my money into a vehicle with no regulated oversight, no investor protections, and no realistic redemption option. She told me that this kind of scheme, targeting widows and widowers over 60, was one of the fastest-growing categories of financial fraud in the country. She also told me that Adrian's name was on 2 documents Clifton had prepared, documents he hadn't shown me, documents my lawyer obtained through civil disclosure. Adrian had signed as a witness. She'd known exactly what the enrollment form was. I sat with that for a while. 3 months later, Clifton was served. I want to describe what happened next, but first I want to tell you something about the morning of the hearing. I woke at 5:30 as always. I fed the birds. And Nuthatch that visits every April had returned, and I took that as a good sign from June. I showered, and I put on the charcoal wool suit I'd worn to my last professional conference in 2019. I had it dry cleaned the week before. I polished my shoes the night before, which is something my father taught me. You can tell everything about a man's intentions by whether he polished his shoes before a difficult day. I did not look like a confused old man who didn't know where his money was. I looked like a land surveyor who had spent 31 years knowing exactly where every line was. In the hearing room at Osgoode Hall in Toronto, Clifton sat at the respondent's table in a very expensive suit with a lawyer who kept checking his phone under the table. Adrian sat in the gallery. She did not look at me when I came in. She stared at the table in front of her, the same way she had the day Clifton had pushed the tablet across my kitchen table, and I understood that she had been staring at tables for a long time, avoiding the eyes of people she had wronged. The OSC panel chair was a woman in her mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, a demeanor like February, not unkind but giving nothing away and very, very cold if you stepped on what she'd laid out. Clifton's lawyer opened by questioning my cognitive state. He used the phrase age-related vulnerability 4 times. He said that the enrollment process had been explained to me multiple times and that I had repeatedly expressed interest. He said the account had been prepared as a courtesy. He said I had been confused about the nature of the investment vehicle and had simply misunderstood what was being proposed. I watched Clifton while his lawyer was speaking. He was doing the thing I had noticed he did when he thought things were going well. A very slight tilt of the jaw, not quite a smirk, but the skeletal frame of one, like he was already composing what he'd say at dinner later. My lawyer stood up and, without theatrics, placed the audio recordings into evidence. She placed the cognitive assessment into evidence. She placed the 2 documents bearing Adrian's signature into evidence. She placed a printout from the OSC's own enforcement database showing that the fund being promoted had no registration and no exemption filing. The room went very quiet. Clifton's lawyer asked for a recess. The panel chair denied it. What happened over the next 90 minutes I could not have scripted if I'd tried. The pre-populated account, it turned out, had already received funds from 2 other investors, both over 70. Both clients Clifton had been referred to through a seniors financial planning seminar he'd been co-hosting in Oakville. The OSC investigator who had been building a parallel case against him had been waiting, professionally patient, for exactly the kind of documented primary evidence my recordings provided. Clifton was ordered to cease all trading activity immediately. His registration application, he had applied for registration as an exempt market dealer the previous year, audaciously, was denied. A freeze was placed on 2 accounts. The civil suit my lawyer had filed simultaneously allowed me to recover the advisory fees he had charged me, fees I had never agreed to, but which had been debited from a joint household account Adrian had quietly added her name to 14 months earlier, a fact I had not been aware of until the bank review turned it up. I got the money back, all of it plus interest, through the civil order. Adrian was removed from the account. No charges were laid against her. My lawyer advised me that pursuing it would be possible, but unlikely to result in conviction given the paper trail, and I told her not to. Not out of weakness. Out of something I don't have a clean word for. She is still my daughter. She had let herself be used. I am not sure which of us will have to live longer with what she did. Clifton received a permanent ban from all trading in Ontario. The fine was substantial. I won't quote the exact number because it's still being appealed, but I'll say it was not a number that would let him keep the BMW he drove to the hearing. When the gavel came down and the panel chair read the finding into the record, I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had expected some heat, anger, or triumph. What I felt was something much quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after you've walked a property line for 2 hours in the cold and finally planted the marker exactly where it belongs. Not victory, exactly. More like accuracy. The right measurement in the right place. I drove back to Barrie alone. I stopped at a Tim Hortons in Innisfil and had a large coffee and a toasted everything bagel, which is exactly what I would have done on any other Tuesday. When I got home, I fed the birds. The nuthatch was on the feeder. I stood at the window for a while with my coffee and watched it. Adrian called 3 weeks later. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was mostly silence with a few words distributed inside it. I listened to it twice. I have not called her back yet. I don't know if that makes me hard or just honest. Maybe there's not as much difference between those 2 things as people say. The clock on my bookshelf still runs. I reset it every Sunday morning after I feed the birds. It keeps good time. Better than most things that look like what they are. I think about the clock a lot, now that it's over. Not the camera inside it. That part did what it needed to do and I don't dwell on the mechanics. I think about what June had engraved on the back. For the man who always knew where the lines were. She meant it as a love note. I've come to understand it as something closer to an instruction. People ask me, when I tell pieces of this story, carefully, to people I trust, whether I feel guilty about recording my own daughter in my own kitchen. I understand why they ask. It sounds cold. It sounds like I had already decided she was against me before I had proof. But that's not quite right. I set up the clock 2 years before any of this happened. I set it up because I was a 65-year-old man living alone, and I wanted a record of my own life. Of what was said in my house. Of what was true. That's not suspicion. That's just the habit of a man who spent 30 years making sure measurements were documented before anyone could argue about them later. What I've learned, and I don't say this lightly, because I spent a long time being angry before I could say it plainly, is that doing the right thing and being prepared for the wrong thing are not opposites. Clifton counted on me being decent. He counted on the fact that decent people don't record their family dinners, don't get cognitive assessments proactively, don't read securities legislation on Tuesday mornings at 6 a.m. because they have nothing better to do. My decency was supposed to be the gap he walked through. It wasn't. And Adrian, I've thought about her more than anyone. She is not a villain in my mind, though she did a villainous thing. She let herself be led somewhere she knew was wrong, and she kept walking because stopping would have meant admitting how far she'd already gone. I know something about that. Most people do, if they're honest. The difference between a person who recovers their integrity and a person who doesn't is rarely about intelligence. It's about whether they can tolerate the discomfort of turning around. She hasn't turned around yet. Maybe she will. I'm not holding the door open, but I haven't locked it either. What I want anyone to hear in this, especially anyone who is older, who lives alone, who has people around them that seem helpful in ways that feel slightly off, is that clarity is not the same as coldness. I did not become paranoid. I did not push my daughter away out of cruelty. I paid attention, I documented, and when the moment came, I had something solid to stand on instead of just my word against theirs. That preparation wasn't a betrayal of trust. It was the most honest thing I could have done, because it meant the truth had somewhere to land. The nuthatch came back again last week. Same feeder, same branch, same April light. I stood at the window with my coffee and I thought, June would have had a name for it by now. She named all the regulars. I never bothered, but I'm starting to think I should. Some things are worth keeping track of, not out of fear, just because they're yours and they matter, and the world has a way of moving on before you've finished paying attention.